Okay, so I was reading this newsletter by David Perel called Monday Musings, and part of the newsletter had to do with throwaway comments. And throwaway comments are the things that people say in a conversation, maybe at the end of a main thought, where they're kind of trailing off and they're not really thinking about what they're saying. But these throwaway comments can be some of the most important and insightful things to dig into in the conversation, especially as a podcaster, when I'm always looking for more interesting things to kind of dive into. And so I'll read the quote from David Perel's Monday Musings newsletter about throwaway comments. So he says, quote, "People reveal themselves in throwaway comments when they're talking but not thinking about what they're saying. A good listener will give these throwaway lines the attention they deserve. A great listener will listen for what's not being said. After all, people speak the loudest in their quietest moments." And I think this is true. There have been a ton of times where I'm on a podcast with someone or I'm just talking to someone in a casual conversation, and they get across their main point, but at the end of the sentence, or kind of when they're not thinking about it, they mention something and I go, "Wait, hold up, like what did you just say?" And they're like, "Oh no, it's nothing." And then I'm like, "No, no, no, say what you just said." And then that is like the thing that leads to a whole nother deeper level of the conversation, something that that person wasn't even really thinking about, kind of had their guard down and revealed something that was super interesting. And the conversation then can go on from there. There's an example. I mean, there have been many examples of times where I've either said a throwaway comment on a podcast that a guest has wanted me to go into more, or a guest has said a throwaway comment where I've asked them to go into it more. One example that sticks out to me for a guest comment is when I had a singer named Naya on the podcast, Niia. And we were talking about something with singing and the music industry. Maybe it was Instagram, social media, something like that. And at the end of that portion of the conversation, she said something about sex robots and having a sex robot, and kind of just went on to the next thing. And I stopped her and said, wait, did you just say you have a sex robot?" And she's like, yeah. Kind of just like it was a normal thing. And it led to this whole nother part of the conversation because I had just listened to another podcast hosted by Whitney Cummings, a stand up comedian, where she talks about having a sex robot. And we kind of went into this whole other aspect of the conversation where we were exploring why men use sex robots, what the future of sex looks like with sex robots involved, and kind of all these other things that just came out of one throwaway comment where she was talking about having an Instagram page that was maybe a private page or something, where she was posting about a sex robot, or just something that she kind of said, not really thinking too much about it. It ended up being a super interesting part of the conversation, maybe a 10 or 15-minute tangent just on sex robots and why she had one and what the future of that industry looks like. There was also an experience I had yesterday where I went into a coffee shop across the street from me, and I was getting a cold brew with an espresso shot, and she asked me if I wanted two. The lady behind the counter that works there asked me if I wanted two espresso shots, and because both espresso shots was the same price as just getting one, because she had to make two anyway. So she asked me if I wanted two, and I said, actually, I'll just take the one because I'm trying to limit my caffeine intake, and I already had caffeine earlier that day. And she mentions, "Oh, my tolerance is pretty low for caffeine." And I say, "Oh yeah, I'm sure it's pretty hard to avoid caffeine when you work in a coffee shop." And she says, "Yeah, that's true, but also I feel like I'm absorbing caffeine through my skin, just working with the beans on days when she doesn't even drink coffee because she still feels that effect. And kind of just like said it as she gives me my coffee. And then I stayed there for probably another 3 or 4 minutes just asking her about if like the fact that she's absorbing it through her skin, because I never heard that before. I know you can obviously absorb things through your skin, you can absorb other drugs through your skin, but I never heard that baristas were getting caffeine just from handling the beans during the day. And she said that she definitely felt a noticeable effect where she was getting caffeine through the beans even when she wasn't drinking coffee. And that was the main reason why her caffeine intake, or why her caffeine tolerance uh, was building up, because she said she doesn't really drink that much coffee compared to the average person, but she's handling the beans all day and it gets on her hands and she's absorbing it somehow through her skin. And that's just anecdotal. I haven't looked up anything for that, but that's an example of a throwaway line that just led to another 3 or 4 minute tangent that I thought was super interesting and led to this cool interaction in a coffee shop. So, my challenge to you and also to myself is to pay more attention to these throwaway lines in conversations. Even if you don't have a podcast, even if you're not putting out conversational content, I think it makes life more exciting to pay attention to those lines when people's guards are down and they're not thinking too much about what they're saying and they just kind of spit stuff out there. And I don't even think they realize what they're saying half the time, but it's kind of like this trail of words coming out of their mouth that's not super calculated. A lot of times when we're talking to people, we're calculating what we're saying because we're worried about what the other person thinks of us. But in these moments of throwaway comments where you've built a level of trust with someone and you feel a little bit more comfortable, then maybe you start to let things fly that you don't think too much of, that aren't super calculated, but that are very interesting. And a lot of times these comments go under the radar and maybe you don't even hear the person. But I think these are some of the most interesting parts of the conversation where you can dig into these comments where it's, maybe trailing off at the end of a main statement and really dig into them and ask that person to stop and go back and say, "Hey, wait, what did you just say? Sex robots? You're absorbing caffeine through your skin?" Because, like I said, it just makes life more exciting, makes conversations more exciting, and it trains you to listen to things that people are saying, even when it's not the main point, even when they're not being calculated. The things that maybe people don't want you to hear or didn't mean for you to hear or pick up on, but that are still good to get into.